Merry Christmas to the Taliban from Donald Trump. I'm Scott Ott, and this episode of Bill Whittle Now is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. And Bill, President Trump tweeted out about midweek this week this tweet. We should have the small remaining number of our brave men and women serving in Afghanistan home by Christmas. That was at about 7:28 p.m. on Wednesday evening Eastern Time. Oddly enough, just hours earlier, the National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien said that the United States would get that number of troops down to 2,500 in Afghanistan early next year. Now, Bill, there's already been allegations from the left that President Trump is all hopped up on steroids and is feeling that enthusiasm that one might feel when on that drug and is not coordinating policy in the White House. How helpful do you think this is when your National Security Advisor says one thing and then several hours later you say something different?
Well, as we discussed in the last show, the President of the United States has many advisors. And the job of the President is to select a course of action, to make a decision that is presumably the best mix of those opinions. And that means some people are going to get their toes stepped on and others not, and so on and so forth. If the argument is that we're going to be bringing the troops home in early 21, and Trump says he wants them home by Christmas, then saying having the troops home by Christmas is a political statement. It has political impact, and and it's not done just for politics either. It's done for the families of the troops and so on. So if the National Security Advisor were to say, we cannot leave, if we leave Afghanistan under any circumstances, then we will expect to see more buildings coming down in the next year. And then Trump says, I want to pull these guys home by Christmas. Now you've got a case to make. But if you're saying basically that he wants to pull them back earlier than the National Security Advisor thinks could be done, then I think that's his prerogative as president.
There is in the Yahoo News story that I read, and I'll quote, the reporter is a guy named Sean Naylor, I assume a guy, and he quotes an unnamed retired U.S. colonel who interacts with, yes, as always, because nobody would want to stand up and say things that they really believe. A retired colonel who closely interacts with CENTCOM and U.S. military headquarters in Afghanistan, saying that you shouldn't take Trump's statement to be a statement of U.S. doctrine, and quoting him, presidential tweets are not an indicator of actual policy adjustments. People in the military don't respond to political and psychological outbursts.
You say he's a retired colonel?
That's what it says in the story.
Why doesn't he put his name to that?
Can't answer that question for you.
No, of course he can't. And no one else can either.
But do you agree with the sentiment that the military is not reading that tweet and going, oh, well, I guess we better make plans to get them home by Christmas?
I agree to some I certainly agree that on an operational basis, the presidential tweets do not determine the official policy, schedule, or anything else of the United States. In terms of if the president tweets are going to be home by Christmas, that means your orders are cut and you can just start planning your vacation now. But given the fact that the news media has spent 4 years turning everything that this man says on his head, we said this from the beginning. We said this before he was elected. We said before he was elected that when people were commenting on his tweets and so on and how outrageous they were and all the rest of this stuff, it became clear to me and to a number of other people that as defective a message platform as this is, it is the only thing that he's got that cannot be censored by the mainstream media. So I agree that, yes, troop movements and deployment schedules are not determined by the president's tweets. Absolutely correct, unnamed lieutenant colonel. But policy is directed by the president, and if the commander-in-chief says he wants his troops home by December 24th, then it is your job, or would have been your job if you were still in the military, to make sure that that happens. And I don't see where this, let me rephrase that, I see exactly where this is coming from. This is coming from somebody who, for whatever reason, is opposed to Donald Trump, if it is in fact a legitimate source, and since they don't put a name on it, who knows? But if it is a legitimate source, then you found out of, I don't know how many lieutenant colonels there are in the United States Armed Forces, but there are thousands and thousands of them. You found one who said, well, this is a really bad idea. Well, guess what? Former lieutenant colonel, unnamed, because there's a lot of officers going around with that tag on. I wonder how many officers there were, I don't know, 5 years, 6 years ago in the Obama administration whose name tag said unnamed on it when they were in the Pentagon doing their duty. But if the president says he wants the troops home by Christmas, then it's your job to get them home by Christmas. And for you to suggest that this is some marked form of insanity is insubordination. And And you don't have to like it, and I certainly didn't like, and many, many, many people in the military did not like what Barack Obama was doing to the American military. But I will tell you this, I think the American people and the American military are far more fond of a president who says we're going to have you home by Christmas after being there for 20 years than one who says, you have to spend your time, you can't train your men anymore, you have to see if they have tattoos that transgendered people might find offensive. So the President of the United States is the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. If he says he wants them home by Christmas, then it is the job of the people in charge of making these things happen to execute the orders of the President of the United States.
Bill, back in February, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, on behalf of the United States, signed a bilateral peace agreement with the Taliban in Afghanistan. And that was an eventual total withdrawal agreement based on conditions on the ground, basically saying to the Taliban, you stop your bad behavior, we'll get out of that country. But Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad, the chief U.S. negotiator with the Taliban, acknowledged in a congressional hearing in September, back on the 22nd of September, that the Taliban had not met these conditions. Meanwhile, after Trump's tweet regarding the pullout by Christmas, a spokesman for the Taliban, which refers to itself as the Islamic Emirate in Afghanistan, the Islamic Emirate welcomes these remarks, meaning the president's remarks, and considers it a positive step for the implementation of the agreement signed between the IEA and the U.S. Bill, clearly, the Taliban is happy with the president's announcement, but the U.S. chief negotiator says the Taliban hasn't kept up its end of the deal. What does this do to a bilateral peace agreement that's based on a phased set of behavior performances when you basically say, well, screw that, we're getting them home by Christmas?
Who cares? Who cares? You're telling me that the Taliban didn't live up to a deal that they signed? You can only imagine the shock. Here's my shocked face. Really? Really? When I say who cares, what I mean by that is this. That ship has sailed. We spent 20 years in that country and lost a lot of very fine people in that country trying to turn that into a country that had some semblance of a civilized nation. And the people who we were working with, not that we can't expect our enemies to work with us, but the people we were working with were simply not up to the task, no matter how hard we tried. And so this experiment failed. And since it's failed, it's time to bring those people home. And for somebody to say that, well, the Taliban's happy about us leaving, I'm sure they are happy about us leaving. I'm very sure they're happy about us leaving. And Afghanistan will return to what it was before then, except with a fundamental difference. The United States departure, United States troops leaving the ground from Afghanistan does not mean that we're finished with Afghanistan. That means only that we are going from a counterinsurgency strategy, which is, in other words, let's try to protect this government. Let's try to give them some semblance of a real government so they can have a future. And let's defend this with our lives. Okay, that has not worked. So that's all. But just because the counterinsurgency strategy is over doesn't mean that the counterterrorism strategy is over. What's going to be going on in Afghanistan from now on is we're going to be monitoring the situation extremely closely. We have not signed a peace treaty with the Taliban. When we see terrorists out in the open and they have a very hard time moving out in the open, then we will simply do what President Trump has done on at least 2 or 3 occasions, and many, many, many others, but 2 or 3 high-level occasions. And that is just have a Predator drone, have a Hellfire missile come off the rack and take out that threat. And that is an appropriate way to deal with these people. And then Afghanistan can solve its own problems. They can figure it out for themselves. Of all the things that I've seen since I started getting into politics, there are some things that really stand out and just go right through your heart. And one of them is a picture of downtown Kabul taken in the early 70s, or maybe it was even the late 70s, versus the same exact picture taken from the same exact location today. In the earlier picture, there were boulevards that were lined with trees, and there were flowers and cultivated grass, and it looked exactly like any modern city. And now it is a Mad Max desert warrior wasteland. And the people of Afghanistan allowed that to happen to them, and they have allowed it to continue to them. And they were given the biggest hand up in the history of the world, as far as I could see, with the possible exception of Japan and Germany. But at least Japan and Germany were more than happy to cooperate with the aid that the U.S. was giving them after World War II. What we found in Afghanistan, and to a somewhat lesser degree in Iraq, is that no, these societies are not capable of doing what we thought they would be capable of doing. They're just not they're just not built that way. The entire ethos, the entire morality structure, the entire difference between a trust-based society versus a shame authority-based society, these differences were too big to bridge. And the evidence is in the past 20 years of our history.
Bill, final question. Even though technically the presidential tweet is not the same thing as, a private set of orders to CENTCOM sent over a secure channel but from the commander-in-chief to the commanders of CENTCOM, he has backed himself into a corner, has he not? If these troops don't come home by Christmas, he has broken his word and shattered some trust that he has with some of his greatest supporters in the U.S. military. Did
you say we're talking about 2,500 people left?
That's what the other statement
we'll just use
was
it as
from
a round
the
number.
National Security Advisor.
The actual number is not important. So if President Trump says we're going to have these troops home by Christmas, and he brings home 2,000 of
no,
the
let me correct that. I'm sorry, because what it's saying is not that there's 2,500. That the National Security Advisor was saying that the U.S. would go down to 2,500 troops in Afghanistan early next year. So that is a different thing than saying there's 2,500 left.
I don't think it's a lie, and I don't think it's a broken promise. If you have, these numbers are coming off the top of my head, but the actual numbers are not relevant to the argument. If there are 5,000 people there now, and the National Security Advisor says we got to get down to below 2,500 in January or March or whatever, and the president says, no, I want them home now. That doesn't mean all 5,000 of them have to come home. It just means most of them have to come home. And you could even make the argument that some significant number of them, if they're coming home early, they're coming home early because the president wants them home early. But at this point, I think the American people have had about enough of Afghanistan, and I don't, as a person who's a student of military history, current and ancient, I don't see. I could make the case for it being a disadvantage getting out of there. I wouldn't be willing to do that anymore, but you can make the case. But to say that hurrying this up is going to somehow hurt the president's chances is.
No, that's
nuts.
That's not what I'm asking, Bill. What I'm saying is whether it's a good idea or not, doesn't he now have to do it because he publicly stood up in front of his, quadrillion Twitter followers and said these people should be home. The small remaining force in Afghanistan should be home by Christmas.
Yes, he does, and I think that he will. Does that mean he will get all of them? No, and I don't think that's realistic. And I don't think anybody who's fair-minded, forget being a Trump supporter, I don't think it's realistic for somebody to say there's 5,000 troops in Afghanistan now, and if he wants them all home by Christmas, well, we had to leave 500 left there to clean up. The bulk of them came home by Christmas. That's a promise that's kept. But look, again, President Trump he understands politics. He understands the politics of emotion in a way that I have never seen a Republican president understand them before. Despite his many flaws, he understands the power of a message like home by Christmas, which goes back almost as far as the Republic. In fact, I can't even think during the Revolution if there was not some thought that our boys would be home by Christmas. Certainly when they marched out to the Civil War, everybody thought they'd be home by Christmas. Home by Christmas is as built into military culture and the history of the United States as any other thing is. And for him to invoke that is an indication to the American people and to the servicemen that we have abroad that this experiment is over and that we're coming home. And home by Christmas has a much better ring to it than home by February 9th. And if it means that we have to hustle this up, then we hustle it up. There seem to be a lot of people out there. And by the way, let me just censor myself. When I say I was about to say there seem to be a lot of people out there that have a problem with this. But the fact of the matter is, that's just not true. How many people are in the military right now? How many hundreds of thousands of people are serving in the military right now? Who spoke out about this? Were there mass desertions? Did people immediately say, I'm not going to re-enlist on the basis of this? You have one unnamed lieutenant colonel who says that this is some kind of crazed drug reaction, and you have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of other people in the military who are doing their job and executing the orders of the commander-in-chief in the professional way that they always have. And once again, this is a perfect example of counting the hits and ignoring the misses. If you have one or two former generals, or as the Biden campaign says, 500 or whatever former high-level military officials have endorsed Joe Biden, okay. But if you have a 50-50 country, that would mean that there should be, tens of thousands of them should be supporting Joe Biden if it were a split down who's a Democrat and who's a Republican in the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and Coast Guard. So again, these numbers are put together in such a way as to sound very, very impressive. 500 former generals, my God. Well, how many living former generals are there now? And if Biden claims that he's got 500 of them, does that mean that the other who knows, 2,000, 20,000? I don't know. I don't know the number of high-level field-grade officers in the country.
I think it does establish how many military members we have who no longer feel it's necessary to observe the long-standing tradition of not getting involved in political matters.
Yeah, there you go. So that alone tells you something. Just to connect it, because I think the stories are somewhat connected, to connect it to Biden's claim that there are 500 former high-level military officials who have endorsed his campaign. That essentially means there are 500 former military officials who have violated the unwritten order, but nevertheless the socially important agreement that military people don't comment on political activities of the commander-in-chief because it is unprofessional and it's detrimental to morale. So it tells you something about those 500 people, that they are willing to sign a document saying that they support Joe Biden. And what it tells me is they have a fundamental misunderstanding about the obligations of being in the military. And if you are going to, let me make myself perfectly clear on this. I am not saying that they have an obligation to shut up in terms of if they see something that they think is a moral imperative and that is an actual genuine danger to the United States of America, then on the contrary, they have a moral obligation to speak up. But what I notice is that I never see people who are in uniform doing the kind of, I've actually seen two cases of this, actually, come to think of it. But generally speaking, it seems to me, and it seems to most other people with a sense of honor and some understanding of the military, that if you are a high-ranking official, or if you're a sergeant or whatever, and you have information on behavior on the part of the president or actions on the part of the president that you think endangers the United States of America, then you have one course of action and one course of action only as far as I'm concerned. And that course of action is you resign immediately. And then if you go public with those allegations, you go public with those allegations with your name on it, and you explain very clearly why this just is an opinion of an order or something that I don't like. I quit my job in the military, and I am now subjecting myself to this barrage of questions and attacks and hates and all the rest of it because I believe that this is an existential threat. That is what courageous people do, and by and large, the number of people in our military are extremely courageous, physically courageous. Moral courage is a little harder to find. But whenever I hear about unnamed former officials or unnamed this or unnamed that, I don't know whether there's anything to that source. In many cases, there isn't. But one thing I do know about that source is that source may think it's important enough to go to the press with it, but he doesn't think it's important enough to go to the press with it with his name on it. And that in itself tells me something about the character of the person making those charges.
The members at BillWhittle.com have made this program possible. If you've not yet become a member yourself, go to BillWhittle.com and click that big green Become a Member button. We think you're going to like it. We offer a rapid and cheerful refund if you don't, and we don't have to do that very often. So go ahead and go to BillWhittle.com, click the button, and find out what you've been missing. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks for watching.